Restop the recording, and here we
Offset.
are. Hey, Ernest, good to see your face.
Hey,
It's been a while.
how are you?
Doing pretty good. I'm dancing between my kids' activities in the house, so I may get kicked out of my room at some point. But I got kicked out of the other room, and so now I'm in the children's playroom. So we'll see how this goes.
He gets kicked into the playroom for work and kicked out of the playroom for play. So
Yeah.
that's the drill. Ernest, it's nice to meet you in person. Well, it's over Zoom in any case.
Yeah, through video.
It's nice to see you. It looks like you're no longer living in a car, which is a step up from when we started this discussion.
Yeah.
Congratulations. So yes, I wanted to do a Zoom call just as an experiment because we had some documentation I wanted to discuss. You had another segue you wanted to start with, Anish, or?
Well, one of the Ernie was asking where Ernest was, and I said, "Do we still find any sea legs?" To which Ernie said, "For Zoom, no. I think he's done a Zoom call before," and it made me think. There's a famous mathematician, I think it was Hadamard, and he said, "Math, no one understands. Math, you get used to." And it got me thinking about data, and I think the same can be said of data: is that nobody really understands data. It's something that you have to socialize and get used to. And this idea of having a set of characteristics that make data fungible is kind of how we make the incomprehensible comprehensible. And there's no limit, especially with large data sets, to how many ways you can slice and dice the data. And so I think the way we make that tractable is we ensure that it's documented, has a lineage. And that got me thinking about the document, the Coherency Manifesto, which reminds me of another hard problem in computer science, but maybe I'll pause there.
Well, that was actually one of the inspirations for using that term. You've probably heard this too, Ernest, that there are only two hard problems in computer science: cache coherency, naming things, and off by one errors, which is probably my favorite computer science related joke. And I use it quite a bit. So, yeah, so in the interest of greater mutuality, let me throw this into a Google Doc and pass it off to you. And
it might even make sense to screen share it, Ernie, because
yes, I will do that too.
Okay, great.
Getting my mechanics done, and
yeah, that's already neat because we want the document front and center and the people on the side, and that's what just happened.
Wait, is that what we want?
That's a good question. Well,
for this purposes, okay, sure, right? Because the whole point of this is we want people front and center and the data and the artifacts in support of them.
Yeah, right. But I would argue that there's a tension between. There is something to be said about putting the work above the people, and that sometimes lets you actually achieve your goal. And it helps me to focus on the artifact and the ideas rather than the vehicle, right, or the presentation.
But one of the things I often yell at you about is I feel like you're is that you need to put the people, is that the point of the work is to support the people.
Yeah, it's tough. And I think that's exacerbated by the fact that we have different specialties as human beings, roughly extroverts and introverts. But when you dive deeply into a technical platform to solve a human problem, it's very easy to lose sight of the human. And in fact, I'd make the observation that the more time I spend with programs and compilers, if I'm not careful, I catch myself getting short with people, because you are used to formal languages and things that either work or don't, and ambiguity, which is one of the things we need to push out of Datocracy, is tough to deal with.
Right, and interestingly, that was my last podcast with my father. We're reading a Neville Shute novel about an aircraft engineer. And we had this big discussion about whether he is pursuing this story of building a charter airline in the Middle East post-World War II out of a love for aircraft and the excitement of entrepreneurship, or is he running away from his failed marriage in London? And this tension of, are we moving towards something positive, or are we moving away from something negative? Are we even self-aware if that's the case? So enough philosophy. Let's put aside the personal thoughts and deal with the document artifact.
Indeed.
Just the short version of how I got here, I was thinking about, okay, there's a number of things that I care about and a few things that we've been discussing on this podcast. And I'm thinking, okay, what are the things that I believe that I think are really important for us to nail down? And then how does it matter? And is this actually something general? And that led me to this idea that you've talked about this before, Anish, at your company, is that the goal of data, the whole purpose of data is to enable us to make better decisions. If you're not making better decisions, there's really no point in having data. And if you know the data, you know the decisions you need to make, then you can evaluate the data against that context. And then I was thinking about this issue of community and society. I realized, this is an interesting way to define a community. A community is an entity that makes decisions together. And then when I was playing with that, I said, well, there's an adjective of that, and I decided to go with the word coherency. Originally, I had cohesion, but in a nod to the computer science problem, I decided to go with the word coherency. And that kind of led me to this series of statements. And I framed this not so much as a constitution, but as a declaration, right? Like we hold these truths to be self-evident.
I love that because as somebody who studies political philosophy and is interested in liberty, there was a marked change between the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. Well, yeah. And they're very, very different documents. And even though one is the spiritual predecessor of the other, they arguably a lot of the romance and the principles of the Declaration was lost by the time the Constitution came to be.
And the reality is that yes, and that is why James Madison is my favorite founding father, because the hard, ugly work of creating government is, far less noble and more necessary than the work of spouting high ideals.
Yeah. An ounce of practice versus tons of theory, as they say.
Anyway, but we got to start somewhere, and so I'll start with the romantic ideal and see. So this is the things that I feel like seem obvious to me is true, and I'm curious, like whether in fact these are obviously true to anyone else, and whether they're in fact interesting or relevant. So, did you guys read through this? Do you have the initial thoughts, reactions, emotions?
I did read through it. It's still marinating. I think 1 and 2 are super reasonable in my mind. You make a really interesting point about adaptation, which is to say, this is the failure case that you hit. Sometimes when you have too much data or you've just memorized your training examples, you get a kind of ossification. It's like, well, we're Google, we're Microsoft, we're Apple. We have gobs and gobs of data and we know everything. So this adaptation, I think, is a critical nuance. And in fact, wow, that's a really interesting thing. So if data has gravity, then maybe decisions have momentum, and momentum can work in both. It can work for you and against you, right? It could be accelerating when you're trying to decelerate, and vice versa.
Okay, so the first 3 you feel good about. First 2 seemed obvious. The third one seems plausible and intriguing. Ernest, did you have any comments on the first 3 points?
I agree with them. I think they're important to prioritize decision making and envision or look or move towards high quality data, whatever that means. I guess it needs to be accurate and be timely. I don't know what.
So I say define it down at the bottom: timely, accurate, comprehensive, digestible. Oh. I'm happy to use timely instead of recent.
Okay, yeah, timely.
There's
trust. Let me trust. You've said it as a general thing, but I think trust is not in the platform. The platform gives us the ability to determine trust individually. One person is not going to trust the same entity as another person. They won't have the same level of trust, because trust depends on values and principles and whether the company adheres to those values and principles. To one person, it might be that one decision did adhere to those. The other person, it might be that it did not. So yeah, we can provide the infrastructure for individuals to determine trust, but trust is an individual matter. It's not a general, well, for the most part, it's not a general thing unless the
Right.
general, it becomes culture. It becomes like an institution that is trusted just by being an institution, such as a court, a hospital, that are trusted irrespective of you get to a new town. Hey, where's the I'm hurt. You trust that the hospital is going to provide you the help you need, by all kinds of rules and regulations. But there's a new store that opens. It depends. Trust will grow in time as as you learn about the company and learn about its values and whether it does actually adhere to its principles and ideas.
Yeah, I think that's what I wanted to get to, and I was struggling with the right language because, trust itself is a complicated, multidimensional, subjective thing, but there's a connection to this idea of, I wonder if the word supported by immutable public histories or something. And there's also something about transparency about the current context and decision-making mechanisms. There's other bits there that I'm not sure about.
Well, this to me it boils down to necessary versus sufficient, and it seems to me that immutable public history. Well, public is sort of implied, but an immutable history is necessary for trust. It's one of the ingredients that's necessary for trust. And even if we X-ray a little bit of what Ernest was saying, trust is either a brand or an entity has a track record, or you need to gather some data points. So in either case, there is a record that leads you to a certain conclusion or gives you enough data points. And what do they say? The plural of anecdote is not data, but that's actually not true. Like in the human domain, at some point, you flip a bit that says you trust this individual or not. And there's probably.
Sorry, did you say you do not agree with the statement? I've always heard the plural of anecdote is data, but then you just said you quoted the reverse, and then you seem to disagree with it.
Well, interesting. So I've always heard the plural of anecdote is not data, which is to say that right. But I guess my point is, in the human domain, we have finite time and finite resources, and you can only afford to gather so many sample points unless you're going to do everything by yourself, which is highly impractical. But so there is some massaging there, I guess, on necessary versus sufficient, but I think you're getting close there. So trust is supported by immutable public histories, right? So if we have and identity is implied by that. Let me jump to the one thing which I think is underspecified. Forking culture implies, well, the word forking it's a very, very precise meaning. And let's not talk about forking processes. Let's talk about forking repositories. You can only fork under very precise analytical conditions, which is to say that we are using the same revision control system. And so, in other words, I think there's a demon hiding for us under 5.
Well, I think you just destroyed my point in your definition, right? Is that you say, well, if we only define forking as this precise, rigorous thing that happens in data repositories, then, well, of course, it limits everything. But my point is that, forking culture is something that happens all the time. Right, like America is a fork of British culture. We discussed that last time, right?
But is there a merge operation?
Yes, absolutely.
Is there?
Yes, yeah. They have imported. Television is one of the common mechanisms, right? Where they import public media. It imports concepts. I mean, a British subject now versus 1776 is much more like what we would consider a citizen.
Okay, right? I got it. So maybe this is a semantics quibble, but I think that's the purpose of the call. To me, it's the optionality of forking. So forking a culture implies culture is the optionality of forking. A culture that entails the optionality of forking is how we preserve cohesion while encouraging diversity. Which is to say, as a cultural value, if you do not agree or do not wish to be bound by the terms and conditions of the fork that you are residing in, you may make a high fidelity or low fidelity, up to you, copy and continue in your own thread of execution, but you can expect to be held to certain standards. Yeah. It's a culture of forking. That's not the same. So when I hear forking culture, I hear that you have a culture, you clone it. I now have a fork of this culture. But a culture of forking is one in which
it's a deliberate play on words. Both culture is a thing I can fork, and that we have a culture that encourages forking.
Yeah, stick a fork in this culture. It's done.
It's never done. That's the whole point.
What is your definition of culture? If you can fork it, well, is it? What is it? Is it a culture of cuisine, a culture of sports? I guess you mean a general culture, but how do you fork that? And how does a person understand? Oh, I'm operating on this fork, not the original, with which I'm very familiar with, because I was involved in this culture. I'm trying to use the term as regular people will understand it, instead of as we are trying to understand it. You see what I'm saying? Like,
so clearly this is playing fast and loose with language and our understanding. I think what's interesting to try and ground this is the idea that the context of this conversation is this idea or the assumption that we are trying to build some sort of communal data platform, and that there is implied some infrastructure that's going on, and that infrastructure has to both support cultural types of forking above it, but also support being forked itself in certain ways to enable innovation and experimentation. And there's probably a very large bundle of concepts that are worth pulling out and being more explicit about. But it's impressive to me that that line 5, even though it's completely vague and confusing, actually pulls on a lot of those interesting threads. So I'll consider it a success as a provocative statement, even if it's a failure at a clear explanation.
There are a couple interesting things you reminded me of. So one was infrastructure to me is close to implementation, and I guess thinking like a computer scientist for a moment, what needs to be agreed upon is the interfaces, right? So the data interchange, right? In other words, this is what this concept of containerization that we talked about, which is kind of still in its nascent phases for data. But when I hand you a data container, if it has a SHA-256 hash, if it has a digital signature, if it has whatever UTF encoding, certain byte streams, file types, there's a reasonable amount of interchangeability around that. And this goes back to our fungibility. So again, I think the emphasis should be on interfaces and standards, as opposed. I know what you mean. You mean a common, like a shared infrastructure, but infrastructure usually means a physical realization. And that's the part that we don't care if people agree on that physical instantiation or not. What we care about is the interchange standards. What was the second thing? Oh, yes. And another thing which I think helps the stage, and which, this is something really interesting. And if you know Balaji Srinivasan, he talks a lot about exit and voice. So when you participate in a system, a democracy, a datocracy, there's a fork in the road. Wow, it's going to come back. It's going to come back even better. And you can either try to change the system from within, which is voice, and democracy is famous for having this facility, or you can disengage from the system and create a competing system or a different system altogether. The thing that fascinates me is that, and this has generally been a binary decision, and the American Revolution is very interesting because it was both about voice and exit. It was voice that became exit. The thing that I'm just really fascinated about right now, I think forking is the first time in history that we have that an exit can become voice, which is to say,
it's the other way around. Actually, usually voice becomes exit, right? Like Puritans, right? They
right.
started out as a voice, and when they
hardcore, yes,
change,
straight up. And in fact, in some sense, well, that's interesting because the idealism decreased. But you start to see the voice in the Declaration, and the Constitution is the exit in some sense. That hey, we're done.
Well, no, the Declaration was the exit. They said we have given up.
Interesting.
Right, yeah, right. The president
but,
said we basically, this was breaking their sworn vows to King George.
Maybe you're right.
The Declaration, that by definition.
Maybe you're right.
Yeah, but what's interesting to me is that I don't know if it's such a hard binary thing.
It has been historically, though.
Really?
So, I think so.
I feel like what happens is at least like the right of assembly is the idea that I can create my sub-community where I'm living within, where we are living within these values. And it's only when, and this is the one thing that actually, this is an interesting phenomena that maybe there's not a good word for it, or I don't know if it's well understood, which is that the idea of utopian communities, right? I can carve out this little patch of ground where we're living by our own rules. And as long as it doesn't get too offensive for our neighbors, I can coexist within the larger community. And that when it gets too hard, then is when you face the choice between. So there's three different things. There's voice, there's exit, and there's enclaves, right? If I can create an enclave where I can practice my values, I don't need to exit, unless there's some hardcore things. The Mormons are a great case study in this, right? They had their little utopian community in Illinois, and they got beat up. And so they fled to Utah and they set up their own community, and it kind of worked. And then they went back and forth with the US government a few times, and they've kind of settled on a reasonable compromise with a few edge cases here and there that still cause grief. But like, it feels like those are all part of the same phenomena.
They're certainly related, and one can turn into the other. Yeah. What's I guess what I think is unprecedented. So, and this is exactly where you got. We haven't. We are no longer under British common law. Neither has. Well, by the way, that's I think apparently case law before the Constitution from England actually still is applicable in some. Yeah, right, I think you brought that up. But from a formal structural standpoint, they're two independent entities. And what fascinates me about forks is, let's take an example. Let's take the Linux kernel as an example. I can be on a branch, I can diverge wildly, but that will may become master at some point, right? So what didn't happen?
It is very rare for the branch itself to become master. It is quite common for innovations on the branch
That's
to
true.
be pulled
You're
into
right.
master.
You're right. You're right.
Because like a branch becoming master is what I think of as like EGCS or HTML5.
Yeah. Yeah.
Where the original master withers away and the authority shifts to the new branch.
Yeah. I guess the main point being that the world of code is a lot more atomic than the world of government, right? So it would imply if both people were to...
If you're talking about at the level of the nation state since the Treaty of Westphalia, I would say that's probably true.
Yeah, it's not just the nation state, but it's like, what do we consider the bylaws of the nation state? So in other words, if this were truly code... And if this were truly code and we were on the succeeding branch, Britain could run an identical copy of our bylaws and our rights. That's not going to happen.
I mean, but don't forget that like lots of organizations will copy and paste Robert Rules of Order of Parliamentary Procedure.
Oh, sure. And India's constitution is a good example. I think they looked very heavily at the American Constitution when they wrote that.
And so people can copy it, but they usually don't because they don't want to adapt it, right? Like just anytime you port a piece of open source code, you tend to, like, the further removed you are from the original context, either in your ideology or your constraints, of course you're going to tweak it, right?
Well, and this gets down to, and maybe this is not the interesting part of the conversation, maybe it is, the fork emerge is a very precise semantic in code. And we need to be careful when we port that metaphor over what the
merge is so I've been using this phrase here. Mechanisms for enabling both edge experimentation plus adoption of others' innovation.
Yeah, and I guess let's talk about datocracies for a second. It isn't just other people's innovations. Let's talk about what assets would be in a datocracy. So first of all, there's the concept of data sets, okay, which is to say something more than a file. And what is a data set? A data set is files plus context. So it's the physical bytes, but maybe some documentation, lineage, immutability, hashing, those kinds of things. All right. So we would traffic in data sets. I think that goes back to what's fungible, or what is it that the nation states of a datocracy would trade in. So the data sets is one. Then there's also like this concept of jobs or analyses, because data at rest needs to run through, it needs to be modeled, it needs to go through statistical analysis, any number of things. What I'm trying to get at is, what are the primitives like that datocracies would trade in, and that might help us understand better.
Interesting when you talk about that. When I was looking at point 4, one definition of a data set is immutable public histories of past decisions and context. There's something there that's similar, right? There is, because when you think about like, I want to know both the track record of this, like if I go to a store, I want to know the track record of the store, but I also want to know what is the current management. Like if the store has had, suddenly a coup where, some Robert or a company has had Carl Icahn come in and sack the entire management and put a bunch of hedge fund traders in charge, then I would not trust that organization at all, even if it's had a wonderful 150-year history. So there's a duality between the decision-making process and the record of past decisions.
Interesting. Yeah, well, that's true. And this goes down to the concept, this is the ship of Theseus, I think, in some sense, right? So, and let's be clear, Amazon has sacked Whole Foods Market. And by the way, I'm one of the old school, very romantic shoppers of Whole Foods Market when it really meant something to be a Whole Foods shopper.
I should ask you that. How much of what has, the sad ending of Whole Foods is the result of Amazon, or was that the cause of the Amazon takeover? Was Whole Foods had lost its marginal benefit, and so it was going to die anyway, and therefore Amazon was just the fall guy, was just the inevitable fate, rather than something that Amazon could have done differently? Because like if they could have done it differently, they wouldn't have sold to Amazon, is kind of the argument. I'll come to Amazon, they were doomed to fall into that trap.
Coming right back to that. So I'll just finish the ship of Theseus problem, which all brands have, which is the problem you're bringing up is this the same brand? Is this the same Datocracy?
Ernest, you may have just context. Ernest, are you familiar with the ship of Theseus claim? It featured in WandaVision, but
into your 1 second.
Well,
I'm not familiar with that, but
I think I can do it very badly. If you maybe you can do a better example.
So the story is that the narrative is that Theseus had a ship, and after his death, it passed on to his heirs, and every piece of the ship got replaced over the years.
Oh, yeah.
So at the end of it, is it still the ship of Theseus or not?
Right. And so that comes to a brand. Like that was what Ernest was saying, is that, hey, if a brand has been looted or sacked, and it's very interesting, and this is, one of the ways in which corporations are not people, but they have some of the persistence and nature and trust of people that is associated with a name and with an appearance. But how do you know that the underlying, the guts haven't been swapped out? Now, to answer your question about Whole Foods, like, yeah, it's a straight up sack. Like, again, it's very easy to romanticize now, but my very concrete data point is the nature of the selection and the small brands that were available, and the attention to the selection of the inventory is basically gone.
Right, the question is which was the order of, so I agree it was correlated with the Amazon takeover.
Yeah,
and the sack.
I understand what you're saying. Yeah.
Yeah. The question is, do we
never know the
blame
answer to that question.
Amazon? But
I do.
Okay, fair enough.
I shop there. I still shop there though, and I still shop on Amazon. So
yeah, so
blame is a relative word.
Yeah, but and some of this point is like something has changed, and it is clear that there's a change, and you are conscious of the change, and so you can recalibrate at least your feelings about it, if not your behavior, to acknowledge that change.
So what is the data? Well, this is a good, fascinating equivalent here. So, and by the way, this happens all the time in open source. The original authors fight, they fork, they hard fork. It's even more visible in the world of cryptocurrency because there's a network effect associated with the hard forks. So I guess what I'm trying to get down to is, how would I know first of all, we want people to have the right to fork, which is to take the data, and then I guess this is where public comes in, and to then derive their own decisions, which may be different from the ones that were made in the past from that same data, right? Or to come up with a different interpretation. And that's the infinite, that's the data no one understands, data you get used to part. And because a lot of our interpretations of data, the Zen have a very brief saying, things which were wrong were considered right for centuries, is socialized through practice. And I think when innovation comes out of a large organization, they break with either it's a return to the principles of the founder, or it's a break with like, oh, this is the thing we actually got wrong, and this is now our blind spot.
Right. So I think I'm actually liking this phrasing, this kind of duality of data sets and analyses as the two dimensions that we look at it. And I say, because like think of the Declaration of Independence, it was a very transparent decision-making process. We say, hey, this is what we were, where we were, and this is why we are doing something different. And you look at that and say, okay, I either believe you or you don't, but at least I know what your claim is. And then I can see how, and we do this all the time. We say, how well do we live up to those ideals that we spouted there? It's like, well, that's a good, but like this one, it gives us a framework to have an open discussion where if it's a secret cabal who just does it, then you have no context for making any decisions or evaluation.
That's right. And that is actually, you brought up a really important distinction, which is,
let me use the word enabled by.
I would like to contrast immutable public histories with fiat, right? So what you just said was that a decision that can be audited is fundamentally different from trust me, or of the secret cabal. That cabal was the term that you used, right? But what does that mean? That means that a decision was made. There's no transparency. There's no visibility into who made the decision and on what grounds. And that is what makes for a fiat decision, right? And there's something, in some sense, I don't know what the difference, that's really interesting. What is the opposite of fiat?
So use it in a sentence. Or
it's usually used in a currency context. So when you talk about fiat currency,
I'll give you one. As a parent, why do we have to do this? Because I said so. That's a fiat
sure. That's fiat. So fiat is by decree or by authority.
So the alternative to that is a rationalized.
Yes, that's right.
It because your sister won last time. And
foundational, rational. Yes, agree. Interesting. Yes. So I think it's important to recognize that this focus on immutable public history exactly is a reaction to fiat decisions. I think that's you're reacting to fiat decisions, which is to say the decisions because trust me. And now I think we have a fairly interesting case study, which we can choose to go down or not, which is you can show two different people the same data, let's say COVID-19 mortality, and one person can come to the conclusion that this is very low risk. Why are we shutting down society? And the other can say, hey, we're going to have an excess mortality. Why? Are you crazy? Why would we open it? That's a good example of where.
And what's funny is that, like, I think you're the one who literally sent me the link to a guy who had a live data model of flattening the curve. And what convinced me to trust this guy was, I didn't understand the model completely, but it's like, dang, this guy has enough faith in his statement. He's willing to put all of his data and all of his analyses on the table to say, this is why I believe this. If you don't like it, change your parameters, make your own decision. Yeah. It's like, okay, that is why I chose to trust him. And that it was still a choice, right? But certainly I go back and forth whether supported or enabled is the right word. But there's something there that the more we have, reliable data of the past, the more we have transparency over how the decisions are being made, the easier it is, not necessarily easy, but the better we have it, the easier it is to come to a communal decision. And the less we have of that, the harder it is.
What do you mean by communal? Because you decided to trust that guy, but somebody, that's you.
Right. But like I said, so California is an example. So Santa Clara County, where I don't know if you live there too, Anish, but certainly Ernest and I live in San Jose, Santa Clara County region.
I certainly did.
Yeah. And so oh, that's right. You're in Arizona now, aren't you? Right.
Yes, correct.
Okay. Yeah. So in Santa Clara County, we had in a period of about 2 weeks, like the first half of March, we went from like only a few people on the fringes thinking that this was a big deal and we needed to change the way we live, to it becoming the conventional wisdom, not universal, but conventional, that we needed to flatten the curve, right? And so there was a process where individuals, organizations, governments, officials, whatever, went through this learning curve. And what happened is that right now, I would say we have a we have a mix of formal data systems and formal decision-making processes and enormous mass of ad hoc data systems that we use to get information and make decisions as a community. Which say Santa Clara County being the community here.
I think it's one level worse. There's a vast, we can talk about Dunning-Kruger in a second. There is a vast number of different capabilities to interpret the data too, right? Based on and you know, this goes back to all the way back. I'm very concerned with how models interact with the trajectory of history, and the Royal College of Medicine model, which was wildly off. Niall Ferguson, I shouldn't name names, but it was wildly off, and it was
some of the model even just of COVID-19 back
the original Royal College. That was is it Royal College of Medicine, Oxford College, something. Anyway,
some British
it was way off. And then when it was looked at from a data science perspective, it was like, the worst modeling hack job. Again, I should be careful who I throw under the bus, but a lot of magic numbers, mystery numbers. And so here's what I'm trying to say. Going back to Balaji, who has had kind of this, he's asked the question of what comes after media a lot. And he said, one of the most constructive things you can do is exactly what influenced you, Ernie, which was to give people a model and let them parameterize it to their heart's content, you see? And so that is one of the ways in which the interpretations on data can vary, because no matter what the model that's produced, we still have the problem of induction. It doesn't tell you about future data points. You can have as much data on the past as you want, and the model can be as sound, but then the model has certain inductive biases. It has to make certain assumptions. Otherwise, it's not a model.
But one of the fun things that you can do is say, okay, if you think that X is going to happen, at least give me a plausible model of what you think will happen and what has to be true for that to be. A funny story, if I may.
And when will you surrender your model, right? This is equally important.
This is a funny story, which I don't know what this means, is I did my very first consulting project when I went from physics to management consulting was to come up with sort of a growth plan for this company that was doing internet business, 1997. It was a big deal, right? And I was given all these data. I looked at it and I did some correlations, and I realized that they had a list of user growth, which looked plausible, a list of revenue growth that looked plausible. I said, but wait, if you do the ratio, we have like the first customer or like the fifth cohort of customers is making like $1 million in purchases per user, right? Because they just come up with two plausible numbers and didn't do any correlation. And it's like, clearly this doesn't make any sense. I pointed this out to my boss. He goes, don't worry about it. It's like, this is what I realized.
Well, there are models.
I'm not in Kansas anymore, right? Because there's the plausibility of the model, and then there's whether people, how much they care about the outcome and whether it matters. And there's this weird,
models can be made to serve different masters. So in that particular case, there's the model that you use to get the sale or to make the pitch or to raise the funds. And then there's the operational model. And founders, well, forget about founders. Those may be different.
I think there's a thing here that I want to say is that if we have these two things, or the more we have these two things, right, this immutable, the data sets and analysis, the more we have the right data sets and the more we have understanding of the analyses, this is kind of the flip side of the first couple of points, right? Is that there's like an adjective here, like wiser trust or more appropriate trust or more effective trust, more right, is that I can trust, the more I have access to these things legitimately, what you did in the past and how you're making decisions now, the more blank I can trust you, right?
maybe we have different types of trust. Like, okay, I can trust this entity to be genuine, to behave according to its principles. I can trust this entity to be um, innovative. I can trust this entity to be inclusive. All those things are part of trust, right? So there's two companies that are very similar in performance, but one of them is more inclusive than another. Maybe I will go with the more inclusive one because I believe in that. So there's not just trust. Well, there's multiple types of trust. So we have, I think it's important to, especially when you throw in forking, because, okay, so you fork, right? So this entity was behaving in a way up to the fork. Did the fork happen because somebody had disagreements, right? So in the new entity, how are the past decisions going to be looked at? Is it the decision made because of the information at the time, or are they going to be looked through the different lens, through the new set of values and ideals? Because you fork, so you fork for a reason. You fork because you don't agree with the values and the behaviors that the entity was doing in the past or has been doing up to this point. So you fork for a reason. So the trust, does it start right here? Do you set a new, change values, or do you have to analyze the history, past history, and see, you know, uh, uh, to what level does past history before fork play a role in trust in this company, right? So a project can say, hey, I'm going to fork from this repository because it's good and it follows our values, or this other one because it's better code and it's more performant, and then we'll like stick our values in there as we see fit. So there's a multi-dimensional level of forking and values computation and levels of trust and types of trust, I think. So that makes it, even though it's easy for coders to say, oh, we just fork, but when it comes to people analyzing using those infrastructure of trust to determine trust, that then becomes really complicated because,
Well,
right,
that,
you have multiple levels of.
I want to run with that last point. I think I have your verb, Ernie. Don't let me forget. I'm going to come back. I think it's magical. So let's pick up where Ernest left off, though, which is to say there's a presumption close to accurate that data is free. It's relatively cheap compared to compute. It's relatively cheap to store and relatively cheap to egress data as compared to processing data. And I guess the hard problem I'm starting to think about is there are certain scales of data at which having access to the data doesn't mean anything unless you have a requisite amount of compute. You can't model the data. You can't even, if you have a data set with 1 billion points, 1 trillion points, take a better example, there's very, very little you're going to be able to do with that without a massive amount of compute. And I don't think we can assume, we do have Moore's law working for us, but I don't think we can assume that compute is free. And we may have some of the problems of socialism that we are declaring a lot of goods and assuming that they should be publicly and widely available, but there's no method for distributing and competing amongst those scarce resources and deciding who should get what. Because what does this mean now? A child, one laptop per child, or
Well, no,
one
but
supercomputer per family?
So I guess to me it's recursive, right? Is that if I have this massive, and this is the reality of life, right? Is that there's a massive data set, I rely on somebody else to digest it for me, right? And then I have to hope that it's a
blockchains work that way, by the way. So that's really interesting. So in the Bitcoin system, you have not only miners, but you have nodes. And the nodes don't actually need a lot of computational power. They just need to check that. So that's an interesting distinction.
Yeah, but I think the reality is the way this works in practice is that in our immediate environment, we have highly digested icons representing all these things, right? And the point is that there's sort of a fiat value of the brand, right? It's whatever an emotional state I have at this snapshot in time, or what they claim in their commercials, right? But then the idea is that that gives me a value, but is that the way I phrase that is that appropriate levels of trust are enabled by having these things, so that if I have a question or if someone raises a question, I say, huh, you're right, that feels odd. If I have access to the data or access to analyses, in the old days I would go to Consumer Reports and say, hey, what do Consumer Reports say about this, right? And that is and I know their algorithm, they publish the algorithm they use to evaluate things and their non-conflict clause and their incentives. And to the extent I trust that, I say, okay, that enables me to make a more rational, that's an interesting adjective. You said you had a magical word you wanted to propose?
I do. I hope it works. So my proposal is appropriate levels of trust are induced by, and so trust is an inductive process, is my realization. And you gather a certain number of base cases, right? So I gather a certain number of base cases that this entity, this individual, this data set is trustworthy, right? Then, I make my inductive leap and say, I believe this data set is trustworthy until it proves otherwise.
So using the word induced, like I would use the word inferred?
No, I'm using induced as an inductive reasoning.
Okay, well, okay, so so induced to me, maybe my brain thinks in terms of magnetic induction as that it's a thing that's caused in you by an external source.
No, this is more like proof by induction, which is okay.
That feels more like inferred to me. Why is that not the right word?
Well, because it doesn't. So there's Hume's problem of induction.
Induced feels like a passive word. Whereas to me,
well,
infer is
that's
like,
a totally separate. It's a totally separate argument.
Well, because I feel like the point is that like I use this data and I make inference, I draw inferences from the data as an active thing that I do.
So let me think about this for a second. Well, so you're familiar with Hume's problem of induction. That's the same context in which I'm using induced.
In where he says induction is impossible?
No, what he says is that the problem of induction is that there is no proof. And this is very important because he uses the word ratiocinative or rational, right? So he says, there is no proof that the future will resemble the past. There is no proof that the future will resemble the past. Right. And so far, philosophers have failed to provide any such proof. And this is exactly the problem of a brand and exactly the problem of a history of trust. Is right. That, well, I have no guarantee as an individual that you will continue to do the things that you have done and that you've proven that you've done. And that is the context in which trust is inductive, is that you gather a few examples, you make a leap, and then you wait for a counterexample.
Okay, so right. So that I get the thing is that trust is
as opposed to deductive. So what you should be opposing inductive with or induced with is deduced.
Right. So I guess the idea that trust is an inductive process, I get. The word induced is foreign enough to me that it doesn't, I have a hard time scanning it in that sentence in terms of the subject object process.
I want to throw in another thing that, this document is supposed to be understandable by a lot of people.
Well, first
that's another problem.
First, let's make sure the three of us understand what we're talking. Okay.
When I read induced and you say it was a passive thing, I'm like, no. People induce a pregnant woman, they induce
induce labor.
Yeah.
To
me, that's an active thing.
That's funny.
So, and that's what I have in my head. And then when you started defining that thing, it's like, oh, what are you talking about? So we have to make sure that these things are understandable by a whole lot of people. So we have to use simpler language, or at least define exactly when you're using a term that is kind of big, you have to define it precisely.
Anyway,
this is a great. This is an infinite problem. So, but
literally, I don't understand what you mean by the word induced. So that's not a great.
Oh yeah. So again, it's an inductive process, but whatever. That I don't. Yeah. I'm not in love with that. What did I want to say? What I want to say is that this. Wow. The process of turning semantics into syntax might just be an infinite number of semantic arguments, because I cannot, if you want to turn semantics into syntax, you want software to eat the world, you want there to be objective logic. It's a lot of splitting hairs and splitting atoms and irritating people and agreeing on terms. There's no such thing as simple terms in that word.
Yeah, but this is
world.
not an infinite problem. This is a finite problem, which is the three of us
I don't know.
in an open process. Like we made it through the
Yeah.
first 3 points, and we're getting pretty close to number 4. Like we are getting to the point where we feel like we have a thing that we are trying to say that we all agree on,
Yeah.
which was not obvious before. And in fact, the fact that we are creating our little Federalist paper point of the discussion means that we give additional context and transparency to our decision-making process. And the reality is that it's not like this document will change the world, but if this document helps the three of us go through a process where we actually understand each other and what we care about, and we're able to articulate that to each other in a way where we say, yeah, we're actually on the same journey, then we have a fighting chance of actually A, building systems that embody these values, and B, inviting other people into the community and having these discussions with them till we get to the point where we say, and actually it'll become, I think, actually the systemic question is, do they get convinced enough that we can then build a system and then have meaningful conversation? You said like the way the Constitution serves the US, we define the syntax of the things we care about. And then we say like, this is the thing we are doing. And they say, oh, I want to do that thing. And then we work it out in practice when we actually make decisions.
Makes sense. That's fair. And this is not it's meant to be a sobering, not a cynical comment. And we're nowhere near this scale, but this process iterated is why the tax code is 40,000 pages, right?
Well, there's also, the reason the tax code is 40,000 pages is because there's a wonderful video my son showed me called The Rules for Rulers. And he says, in order to maintain power, power is the ability to get other people to do what you want. In order to have the levers of power, the people who hold the keys have to get what they want. And so in the olden days, you would have corruption where you would just give big piles of money to the duke that you wanted to support you, or a franchise to tax this land. In the modern term, the tax code is the way they divide democracies, divide spoils among their supporters. Mm-hmm. And that was and I thought about that a lot when I was writing this, is that, that's always going to be the case, that we have these human incentives. The best we can hope for is to create a context where we're encouraging immutable public histories and transparent, so that ecosystems that or sub-communities that do a better job of these things have a fighting chance at out-competing those based on cronyism and corruption.
Yeah, that helped me come up with, I would like to deepen the definition of forking culture that you have there.
Please.
And what I think it is so it's the ability to reject others' interpretations of the data and provide your own. And you have to be careful that doesn't become a denial of service mechanism. But it seems to me very important that no interpretation is sacred.
Well, I think that's the thing, is that anything that you do, I have a chance to do it differently myself. That's what I mean by edge experimentation.
Well, that's very unclear. That's just a totally new term, which is why, like, I think the forking culture definition would get clearer if you made a distinction between mainstream and branches.
I don't know if there is a distinction, to be honest.
Yeah, I agree that, well, forking, right? You can say there's a forking manifesto or whatever. We, although we pick some of the things that the head has done, we reject these other ones. So we pick this one, but we reject these other ones. So we have a new, when you fork, I think the thing is that you have a new foundation of your values. And you it's not the same, it's not identical as the other one, unless,
No, it could just be a dissent, though. Like, in other words, let's say you and I both work for the same company and we build kernel software. When I fork you, I don't necessarily have different values. I just think I can do it faster. Do you know what I mean?
Well, I think you just said you have a different value of velocity over stability.
Performance.
But what if we're both trying to figure out how to solve a problem? And
but we have different ways of doing it. You have your way and I have my way. So in that sense, let's say I value correctness and privacy a lot more highly than performance. You value performance. So we might end up with similar solutions, but yours will be faster, but mine could be more secure. So
you can also use the term
there are pure
rather
wins
than value. There are at the end, but where you figure, but then, and if that's the case, then one person's branch with his way, and I say, okay, yours is just totally better than mine, and we merge, or I abandon mine and adopt yours,
Yeah,
right?
that's the opposite of a trade-off. There's a trade-off, and then there's like what you just described was a domination. I know that's the right. In other words, that's we say when one heuristic dominates another, or one objective function dominates
Right,
another.
but the point is, and I gotta move to closing arguments now because it's 5:30 and I gotta go cook dinner or help with that and stop making annoying noises in the playroom. Is that the reasons for doing it and the reasons that win, can vary from individual and community to community. To me, the real point is that competitive ferment is explicitly endorsed as a positive good, right? The idea that there isn't just one way to do anything that everyone has to adhere to all the time. Like we may decide within a community that like, hey, we all do this as a convention, but there's at least a context where people can say, well, I want to take my marbles and go do this somewhere else. And there's a whole trade-off of sandboxes versus what is fits within the trust thing. But the point is that's what we're trying to get to. And I think that like there's a lot more detail and richness here. But I think we all want something very similar, which we can use the term forking culture until we come up with a better one, or we can try and define it more precisely. And I think that's, and that's why even the word mainstream is a bit difficult for me because like there may not be a mainstream.
Well, that's really true though. There's usually a prevailing, I don't know. There are usually singletons for like a culture, a company.
There are mainstreams.
Yeah.
There may not be a mainstream.
Sure. Yeah, that doesn't seem
American
right to
culture,
me though. So
in American culture today, we could argue we have two mainstreams.
Well, okay. If we think about a corporation, they, decisions are made when you tape out a chip, right?
If you have
there's a chip that ships.
Your premise is what I object to. Right? If you have hierarchical organizations with a rigid formal set of control, well, of course there's a mainstream there.
Interesting.
But a community
doesn't
necessarily have a mainstream. Well, yeah, there's a value to doing that. I encourage people to create those things and build those things, right? But I can imagine a world where, this is why this is a communal thing rather than a organizational thing, right? A community has is a more organic thing where any given time there's a dominant narrative, but there are times when the dominant narrative shifts and you could be between dominant narratives. One could argue we are in that state as the American body politic today, where it's not clear what the mainstream is.
A quick nuance, and then I will.
It's the predicament we have to deal with.
Yeah. So I guess I'm interested in this question of what is the difference between forking and insanities, and I want to add something to your last comment.
Forking and insanity, you said?
Yeah. What's the difference between forking and insanity? And I'll explain that. So in other words, if forking is just a dissent mechanism, then it can be a denial of service, right? And so I have something to add to anything you can do. I can choose to do differently and prove by analysis. In other words, it isn't enough that we have a shared value of forking, which is dissent. It must be the case that we will both submit to reason. And again, different people, different lines of reasoning. But again, anything you can do, I can choose to do differently and will prove by analysis. Without that, you have only a mechanism of dissent, and people will dissent just for the sake of dissent, or fork just for this. Forking becomes a political thing because you can gum the works, you can stop the machine by forking.
It could be dissent, and it can also be just adoption. It could be both. Like, I like this project, I like this particular thing that they do. I'm going to fork that because I like that. But if I don't like any of it, there has to be something, either, like I said, dissent or adoption or a combination, because the third option is to just start another project, to create one from scratch. But the reason you don't do that is because the other one has something that you have to operate on. For example, the document, the history that makes it worthwhile to start from that. And maybe that's it, the history. You like the history, and that's the only reason you're forking, because the history and has something important that you need to do whatever. to trust, to implement things, and that's why you choose to fork. It doesn't have to be purely a dissent thing. It doesn't have to be purely an adoption thing. It's just you want to look to the problem through a different set of values, a different set of eyes, a different point of view. But it doesn't mean that you don't like it. It means that, like you said, hey, I want to do it a little bit faster. But you can say I adopt every single thing that the head project has, except for the fact that they don't go further into performance, into making things faster. I want to just make it faster. Like I want to be the fast version of this thing. I'm not changing anything else other than making faster, using better algorithms, whatever. So you could be really, really close to the thing that you fork, but have a little change. Like you're doing code too, right? You're doing that in code. Yeah, you wanna have better security, whatever. So that's I don't know what the point was, but that is, yeah, it's not just black and white, or one out of three. It can be a set of things that you fork for. But essentially, I guess it could be that you want the history. There's some history in there that defines you, and you want to say, hey, I'm going to fork this project because it has a nice history, and I'm getting that. But everything else, how the values, I disagree with. The ideals, no, I disagree with that too. But I like the history. So that would be like I guess it could be the minimal reason why you fork something. You want to inherit that history, and then you can add to that. But if you don't want to inherit the history, you fork just because of the values. I don't know, maybe, but I guess at that point it's better to just create something, and start a new data repository, and have your values and go from there, instead of having that baggage of the old stuff that you're overriding anyway. Why not just start a new one? So there's better several reasons why you will either fork or create something new, and people are free to do that, right? And it doesn't have to be a black and white, adversarial thing or adoption thing. It could be just a combination, or even neither, right?
I got very excited, Ernie, because I thought you were going to type that the fundamental human right is to choose what is right for myself, but the fundamental human responsibility is to choose what's right is to choose what is fair for others.
Mm-hmm.
I got very excited about that. So I thought you were going, the fundamental human right is the freedom to choose for myself what is right. The fundamental human responsibility is the duty to choose for what is fair to others.
Yeah, we can see that in the mask situation, right? Or I have the freedom to not wear a mask. Well, exactly. Yeah, you do, but you cannot put other people's lives in danger.
But like,
I think fair is that. Well, anyway, but yeah, that's a whole. We should have that discussion, because I think it's a very tangled.
We made it through, I think, 3.5 points, or maybe 3 2/2 points. So I think that's pretty good, actually. And I think we will stop here. I think I'll have to figure out which YouTube channel to post this video on, since it won't fit on the podcast feed, but that's a technical problem I will let you know about, since I have 3 or 4 I can choose from. Probably the one on designing human systems. That is a whole nother series of conversations, but it's close enough. All right, any final comments before I abandon you?
Go forth and cook and play with your kids.
All right, thank you, gentlemen. This was a blast.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, guys. Talk later. Bye-bye.
Bye.